Welcome back. This lesson is following up after installing Bepoz in the previous lesson, because once everything is installed, we are really just getting started. There's a world of configuration options ahead for us that will encompass much of the rest of this course. But before we can take a deep dive into back office and build a database throughout the remainder of this course, we do first need to lay the foundation in this System Setup 101 lesson. We will be covering core concepts in this lesson, such as product sorts and types, the difference between a venue, a store, and a till, and much more. Taking a look at our agenda here, the very first thing we'll be doing is running through the workflow that takes place after installation when back office is opened for the first time and we begin setting up the database. So you may have skipped ahead and opened back office on your machine already, but if you have, we will run through that workflow and that process together. After that, we'll have a look at what's called the venue, stores, and tills list. That's also where we can access the global settings. If you're confused about that and the nomenclature there, don't worry, I'll explain the hierarchy and the concept behind all of that throughout this lesson. And we will also cover an overview of adding devices such as printers and till drawers. Along with that, we'll get into some basic system configurations within global settings, venue settings, store settings, and till settings, while highlighting and focusing on a few of the most important configuration options in each of those areas. And we will finish up this lesson with a quick look at the rest of the system setup components, most of which we'll get into detail throughout this course, but not into detail today. But since this is a System Setup 101 lesson after all, we should at least touch on them as a whole and explain what's what for now. Before we get started, this would be a good time to stress that while not in all cases, but in the vast majority of cases, the configurations that we'll be looking at in this lesson should be completed by, or at least with the assistance from, either a Bepoz technician or an equally qualified individual. So, getting into it, now that we've installed Bepoz and we've created our new database, the next thing we'll need to do is open up back office and begin setting everything up. Now, for starters, when back office is opened for the first time after we've created our new database, as I said, we'll be run through a workflow to just start defining things like the organization name. By all means, we could just click OK and come back and change some of these configurations later. But while we're here, we may as well at least give our organization a name. Just call this one Bepoz Training Co. Cool. Now, these global settings here contain our configuration options that relate to the organization overall rather than to a specific venue or store, but I'll explain more about all of that momentarily. For now, we will just click OK to move on. But we will come back to these global settings in a bit to sort of overview them and run through some important setup requirements. But for now, we will just continue with this workflow that happens when back office is open for the first time. So after that, we're then taken to the venue maintenance, where we have a lot more configuration options and we can name our venue. Cool. So these settings that are within this window called venue maintenance will apply only to this venue. So multi-venue organizations can have different settings per venue. Now we'll be staying away from much on multi-venues in this course, but just wanted to at least mention that while we're here. So a bit of background on that. An organization in Bepoz can have multiple venues, and each venue can have multiple stores, all with different configurations at different levels of the hierarchy. Some of that will be explained more in this lesson and some in others throughout this course. Again, we'll come back to some of these settings in a bit, and others within venue maintenance that we don't get to today. We'll cover in other lessons, so let's just move on for now. Click OK to save our venue. Cool, and the same idea with the store. We'll just give this one a name. And some more configurations here that will apply to each store individually, but we'll come back. And then we've got our first workstation, and for this one I'll just leave it as first workstation, and we'll save that. Now, once all of that is done, we do need to sign into back office still. So now that we've got back office open, we've got our organization, our venue, our store defined, we can chat a bit more about the tree structure and the hierarchy of the venue, stores, and tills list. Now this venue is called System Setup 101, and if you're wondering why, if we head to our side menu in back office here, we have a sub menu called System Setup, which is where we're going to be spending the rest of our time in this lesson, or at least the most of the rest of our time in this lesson. And wouldn't you know it, at the top of this submenu is an option called Venue, Stores, and Tills. And if I click that, it will eventually open up a back office tab for the venue and till list. But at the moment, we are going to need to take a brief detour to our operator settings and make sure that the operator that we are logged in as, in this case we can refer to the top, I'm logged in as master setup. We need to make sure that that operator has the privileges enabled to be able to access what we need to do in this lesson and what you need to do on your end. Now, we will be covering the operator list and operator privileges in detail in another upcoming lesson, but for now, if we go to maintenance and we find our operator record and we open that up, we head to our general tab. I'll need to turn off this use group settings flag, more on that another time as well, and we will turn on all of our system setup flags. Now if I save that, I'll close the operator list, head back to our system setup menu, I will be able to access the venue, stores, and tills list. One of the first things we should chat about in this little is this little tree structure that we've got here that we can see in the venue, stores, and tills list. Now, once we get into creating an operator list and product list, and we have some bigger trees that are built out, we will revisit this concept when we can see multiple branches of the tree, but even one like this is a decent example. If we just ignore what these are and we think of them as having a parent-child relationship to one another or as being branches of a tree, we start with the highest level and then branch out or down, however you choose to sort of visualize that. Where this list does differ a bit from others in back office that we'll come to in other lessons is that we are somewhat limited in the venue, stores, and tills list as far as the number of branches that we can go, but the same principles still do apply to all of our tree lists throughout back office. So for instances like the operator list and other places that the tree list are found, such as the account list and product list, we can have records, so product records for example, and those can be placed into, rolling with the product example, they can be placed into what are called product groups, and then we can have groups, under groups, under groups, under groups to create additional layers or branches of the tree. But again, we'll get more into that in some upcoming lessons. Anyway, for now, the organizational tree list that we can see here is displayed on the left side of the tab, similar to the tree structures that are found elsewhere throughout back office. However, rather than starting with a product group or operator group, this tree list starts with our global settings, which can be double clicked to access said settings, or if I cancel out of that, we can access them via this edit global settings button at the top of the tab. Again, more on the global settings in just a bit once we get through this hierarchy explanation. So each of the succeeding branches of the global settings can be expanded to show the venues or the organization's venue, configured stores, configured tills, and devices that belong to each till. You can see they're all expanded here, and we we can collapse those in as well. I haven't mentioned devices yet up until now, but you can see that a printer device has been added to our till1 first workstation here by default when this database was created. Also, notice that when a venue, store, or till is selected from the tree list, its child components data will be populated in this report section of the window. So for example, when a venue is selected in the tree list, the venue's store is going to be populated over here, and double clicking on a venue, store, or till will open up separate windows containing the relevant settings for those components so that they can be edited or referenced as needed. Cool, so I mentioned a bit of the hierarchy there, but let's get into that a bit more. It does begin with our global settings, which is just any organization as a whole. You may have gathered that already. Next then, we've got our venues, and each organization must have at least one. If an organization has more than one venue, it's considered a multi-venue organization. Again, we won't be spending much time on anything related to multi-venues throughout this course, but I will mention them from time to time as we come across their related settings just to point some things out. So yeah, each organization must have at least one venue, and each venue must also have at least one store, and at least one workstation in the venue as a whole. So that means that there can be stores without workstations in them. If you're wondering why that is, it can be helpful to understand that stores can be thought of as the various stocking locations of a venue and may not always be locations that necessarily sell anything to customers. In fact, one of the main differences between venues and stores is that stock or inventory, it might be called, belongs to a store within a venue, never to a venue itself. We'll get more into that when we cover stock control in some upcoming lessons. But some examples of stores within a large venue could be bars, restaurants, retail spaces, warehouses, production kitchens, etc. You can see that in our database here, I've just added one called main restaurant. So each store can be considered to be a separate entity within the venue when it comes to things like operations, stock control, reporting, and some system configurations. Larger venues such as clubs or casinos may have many stores, whereas smaller venues such as standalone restaurants or retail operations may only have one or two stores in the venue in the global organization as a whole. Lastly in the hierarchy, or almost lastly in the hierarchy, stores do have tills, also known as workstations, sometimes referred to as SmartPOS, which is the Bepoz software that runs on them and can be used by operators to perform sales, as well as a variety of other functions that we'll get to throughout this course. Those transactions and functions can be customer-facing transactions such as selling products or redeeming a voucher, or they can be internal transactions or functions such as completing stock control functions or running sales reports and so forth. Anyway, back to the hierarchy: global, venue, store, till, device. And the hierarchy created in the database should reflect the physical real-world setup of the organization, although there are instances where virtual tills may need to be created and things like that, but that's a topic for another day. It's also important to note that aside from printers like we've got set up here, other devices such as till drawers, FPOS devices, customer screens, etc. are added to tills and edited from this venue, store, and till list tab as well. Speaking of adding things, to add a new component, whether it is a venue, store, or a till, the first thing we need to do is to make sure that the next level up in the hierarchy is highlighted in the tree list, and then we can either right click and select add whichever the component is underneath that, Or we can simply, with the component highlighted, then select the Add New button from the top of the tab here. A small window will then open, prompting to select an existing one to copy, or for workstations and devices, we can choose to start from blank. Now, the workstation from here will differ depending on what we're adding, but not drastically. In the case of adding a workstation here, we just need to enter the name first, or I'll just leave this as the default and click OK. And then we'll get a new maintenance window opened up for our new component that we're adding. We will cover creating additional stores in another lesson, and we'll touch on devices in just a minute. But depending on what's being created and if it was copied from an existing component, some of the settings will automatically be copied or can optionally be carried over from the copied component, and our new component can then be edited and saved. In this case, what I'll do is just set the till mode here to till, and I will save this workstation. We'll come back to workstation settings in a bit. But that process there, that simple process of adding a new component to this list, is nearly identical whether we are adding a venue to the global organization, adding a store to a venue, adding a till to a store as we just did, or adding a device to a till. Speaking of adding a device to a till, well, actually before we get there, I should mention that the reason that till 1 is bold here is because it's the venue's smart controller or server workstation, and it is highlighted in yellow because it's the back office workstation that is currently in use. It's the workstation I'm using at the moment. Anyway, back to adding a device. You may be asking yourself, what is a device in Bepoz? Even outside of Bepoz, a device can just be defined in general as a piece of equipment, or, and this is a dictionary definition, a piece of equipment or a mechanism designed to serve a special purpose or perform a special function. It's a very suitable definition for our needs. Now, devices in Bepoz provide a varied mix of functions and tasks that help us complete functions and tasks, I should say. Covers everything from making till receipt printing possible to aiding in interfaces and integrations between Bepoz and other software applications. And saying that, some devices are tangible devices, so things like till drawers, printers, secondary screens, things like that, while some are going to be a bit more intangible, such as things like accounting links and transaction queues and different things like that. One important note to keep in mind, though, is that some devices need to be added directly to the smart controller server workstation so that the function that's being managed by the device can be handled at a global or venue level. With all that being said, let's just add a till drawer to our till 2 that we just created. So again, the first thing we need to do, of course, is to select that, make sure that the till is selected in our organizational tree here, and then again, we can either right-click, add new device, or we can just have that highlighted and go with add new device at the top of the tab. And we will have the option to copy an existing device. In this case, the only option, obviously, is the default printer that was created with the database. Or alternatively, what I'll do is select blank device and we will start from scratch. That is going to open a new window for us labeled as Device and Interfaces Maintenance. And yeah, I know we're adding a drawer as an example, but a lot of what we'll be going through are just generalizations that apply to all devices, no matter what the device type is. So we will need to name the device. This is required to be able to save a device, by the way. Cool. But then we should make sure that the correct workstation is selected. So we've got that one here, but Just note that that can be changed in the future if we need to move a device from one workstation to another, for example. Next, we do need to select the device type, in our case, a drawer. But before I settle on that and select it, just notice that we've got all these different device types, and depending on which one is selected, if I just tab down through these, we can see that the configurations within this window do change dynamically where applicable, just depending on which device type is being selected and which device type is being set up. For example, some devices will require selecting an external DLL name. If I can find one there we go. Will require selecting an external DLL name and then a class name from these drop downs. Some will have a subtype dropdown, some will have some communication settings, TCP/IP settings, other settings, so on and so forth. Again, just depends on what the device type is. And most will have some varying device options that will be found in that section. But for our drawer, I will just leave the defaults alone. I'm not actually setting up a till drawer on my machine, just wanted to use this as an example, but this should highlight the fact that a lot of the device configurations will vary from one instance to another, depending on the hardware being used, how it's being used, and how what needs to be communicated with, and so forth. Aside from all that though, before we save this device, one other thing I'll point out while we're here is that while we can delete a device, we do have this inactive flag here that can be used to make a device temporarily inactive as opposed to deleting it. And then we can disable that flag to make an inactive device active again. But anyway, when everything looks good, we would just click OK to save the device, and we can see that that has been successfully added to till 2. Remember, we can always come back and edit that if we need to. So after skipping all the way ahead through the organizational hierarchy, adding a till to our store and adding a device to that till, let's go back to the top with global settings and explain some things here. One of the first things you may have noticed is that global settings are split out into a few different tabs here. And this concept of having tabs within components to split out settings and configurations is a concept that's found throughout back office. It's just used as a means of organizing and structuring settings for components where it would be nearly impossible, if not completely impossible, to fit everything onto one screen or onto one tab, and it does just sort of help to clean things up and make configurations easier to find. So starting with this main tab, you can see that also within a tab, settings are often further broken up into sections of related configurations, which is another common concept seen throughout back office. And we'll chat about a couple of these specific settings in a bit. But on the other tab, we've got the ability to set up a few different loyalty rewards. So a common use case for these is sort of the tried and true buy coffees and get the 6th for free type of thing, the punch card reimagined, if you will. Then on the flags tab, we have exactly that, a whole bunch of flags that sit at the global level. I'll explain more about that in a minute, and we'll go through a couple of these settings individually in a few minutes as well. I'll skip over to the sorts and types tab for now, because these are arguably some of the most important settings in the system, so we'll take a deep dive into these next. The other names tab we can use to define things at the global level that are then used for integration purposes, stock control, accounts, etc., and we will revisit this tab as needed throughout upcoming lessons. Same with the reporting tab. We'll come back to this when we get to the reporting lessons, but for now it's still good to know that this exists and where to find it. And the SmartPOS scheme tab is used to set up how SmartPOS workstations in the organization will look as far as the overall aesthetic, and we'll cover this when we get into adding products to the till and till setup in a few lessons time. And lastly, in global settings, we have the cloud tab, a bit higher level than we'll be getting into in this course, but it contains all of the cloud, Bepoz Online, and my Bepoz configurations that are necessary for organization-wide implementation. Anyway, for now, we will head back to the Sorts and Types tab. And yeah, not being too dramatic here, but sorts and types are the foundation of what makes Bepoz, or the foundation of the database from a product perspective, which then relates to reporting and so forth. So we'll spend a bit of time here discussing what these are, recommendations or best practices for setting them up, and how they're then used throughout the system once they've been configured. Now obviously, since this database is brand new and yours will be also, there's nothing defined here yet. And before we do start defining the database's type groups and product types and sort groups and product sorts, I should preface with a bit of a disclaimer that there is not a right or wrong way to configure sorts and types. There just isn't. That same principle holds true when setting up many things in Bepoz. There's oftentimes going to be multiple ways to accomplish an outcome, from configuring the database's system settings to defining a product key map and till function map to creating and organizing the operator list. Just a couple examples. Now there are going to be some principles and best practices and things like that to follow, but in many cases, sorts and types being one of those many cases, there really is not a right or wrong way to configure them. But to assist with the customization that we have of sorts and types, we do offer the ability to define up to 30 product types, up to 30 product sorts, and 8 of each for type groups and sort groups. Now these don't all have to be used, but that amount is certainly more than enough for you to use when configuring your sorts and types however your organization would like to. Now exactly how these are configured will be highly organization specific and dependent on the products that are going to be stocked and sold within the organization, and we can call that the product mix, even though there is a bit more to it than that, which we'll get into when we discuss products and stock control in detail in some other lessons. But for now, to keep things simple, we will think of the product mix as just the assortment of items that the organization is going to purchase from suppliers and stock within the organization's stores, with the intention of either selling those products to their customers or using the products as an ingredient of something that's going to be sold to customers. So then the consideration is how that product mix or that assortment of items being stocked and sold should be organized to be used throughout the system, and that is where sorts and types come in. Now we obviously haven't covered the product list just yet. That's coming up in a couple lessons, but when we do, you'll see that the product list is comprised of what are known as product groups. I think I've mentioned these already. So we can think back to that tree list explanation from the venue store until list here. So within the product list, the product groups are used as a way to organize the system's product mix within the list. As an example, beverages might be one group with a couple subgroups branching out, maybe non-alcoholic drinks and alcoholic drinks, and those subgroups might have their own subgroups. Perhaps the alcoholic drinks subgroup has 3 additional subgroups, maybe one called beer, one called wine, one called spirits, and then maybe the beer subgroup has its own subgroups. They could be based on the variety of beer or the hop region or ABV or whichever factor the organization wants to organize their beers based on, but hopefully you get the idea. And we can then use the system's product groups that are set up and structured like that for some reporting purposes. But when it comes to things like setting up remote printing or creating what are called product profiles, some advanced sales and stock reporting, configuring promotions, account pricing, so on, these are all topics that we'll come to over the upcoming lessons in this course, but that is where sorts and types can play such a big role by giving us alternative ways to arrange and organize products into these groupings that we define here, and then assigning our product types and product sorts to each individual product within the product list. So one of the more common or best practices is to at least loosely, base the product groups on the system's sorts and types. Again, this will all be situational, dependent on each organization's preferences, but we might configure our type groups, something like packaged beverages. Whoops, didn't mean to save that. Packaged beverages, other beverage, food, dry goods, and retail. And you can see that the type group 1 has initially been assigned as the type group to these product types. So we can change those momentarily, but we might have some product types which we'll then assign those. And what happens is when we assign the type groups to the product types, they'll then be grouped together for reporting. So and we can report on both the type groups and the product types themselves, and same for product sorts and sort groups. But we might go with NA, packaged bev, alcoholic packaged bev, bulk soft drink. Actually, I'll pause here and I'll pick back up in just... Okay, but there we go. So for our product types, we've got non-alcoholic packaged beverage, alcoholic packaged beverage, bulk soft drink, spirits and cocktails, wine and sparkling, juices and mixers, food for sale, food ingredients, paper dry goods, so on and so forth. We've then assigned the different type groups to their respective product types, and we'll do the same thing over here for our sort groups. We might just have sort groups of food, beverage, retail, and other. Maybe just keep it a bit even more simple. And then to be mostly reminiscent of different courses that are served and the organization will want to then report on, we might have something like starters, entrees, mains, and I'll pause here for a minute and finish up, and I'll resume in just a sec. And then our other product sorts here for food, a couple for beverages, and then one each just for other and retail. And then we've got those sort groups assigned to these product sorts as well. So remember, this is just one of about a million different ways that sorts and types could be set up. Regardless of how they're set up, though, the main takeaway is that there will typically be some major similarities between how the sorts and types are defined and how the product list is then going to be organized. And we'll see more of that when we get into product maintenance in a couple lessons again. Now, both the product type and the product sort, which are assigned to products, can then be used for a number of things, some of which we'll see in upcoming lessons. One example would be that they can be used in reporting, such as the till balance, where we can see which quantities and amount of each sort and type that were sold, so grouping the products of the different sorts and types together and reporting on those. A second example of how sorts and types could be used is in what are called product profiles, which can then be utilized for several things in their own right, from marketing and promotions to account discounts and things of that nature. And for promotions, which I mentioned, we can also select an entire sort or type for a promotion to apply to, as opposed to a product group or an individual product. We can actually apply promotions based on sorts and types. And another common use case is assigning product sorts to courses for remote printing purposes. We can also set up printer formats to group products on receipts and kitchen dockets based on their sorts and types. So a few of these things we will see throughout this course, but that covers a pretty extensive look into sorts and types for now, at least the best that we can do for now. But again, rest assured that we will be going through examples of those use cases that I just mentioned throughout this course. In the meantime, feel free to configure your sorts and types as desired, and if they do need to be altered a bit as you build out your product list, that can be done then quite easily. We are not finished with global settings just yet, but I do just want to save these for now. I've done all that work. I would hate to mistakenly lose that. So we'll head back to our main setup now with those, or our main tab now with those saves. Just want to go over a couple things here. Firstly being the group total mode, which directly relates to those sorts and types that we just configured. So this is used to establish which group totals are going to be used in reports, like the account summaries is one, where product totals can be reported either by sort groups, type groups, sorts, or types. While we're here, we should go over this profit reporting dropdown as well, which will determine whether the organization's profit reporting includes or excludes tax. This may come down to organizational preference or may be influenced by your region or your country. You can see the options here include a range of combinations of whether the cost price and the retail price, or the retail sales price I should say, separately include or exclude tax, or not. The rest of these settings in this tab we will revisit as needed in other lessons, but before we finish with global settings, I do just want to explain a few things on the flags tab. A few flags here. So we'll start from the top with use till certificates. This is referring to workstation security. So predominantly in wireless environments where if this flag is turned on, each till will need to confirm that it has a matching certificate to that of the server. That's going to provide some security against unauthorized tills, again, predominantly in wireless environments. I'll skip down a few here to server back office license allocated, which is another important one for many organizations. If this is turned on, it will earmark a license for the back office workstation. Then, any additional workstations would share any additional remaining licenses that are available. If it is not required for the back office workstation to have a dedicated license, then we would disable this flag. At that point, all workstations, including the back office workstation, would then share all available licenses. Cool. We'll save most of these other flags for their respective lessons, with the exception of this net total makeup and tax calculation section, which we should just quickly go through now. So as the name implies, the function of these flags, or this section overall, is to determine how the reported net total is determined and how reported tax is going to be calculated. So the organization can optionally choose to include service charges, inclusive taxes, and handling fees, and to deduct order discounts based on their four specific functions, which we'll cover in some upcoming lessons exactly what those functions are. Also, each of the system's 30 item discount totalizers can be added back into the net total, and we'll cover what discount totalizers are in an upcoming lesson as well. But for now, just a couple more notes on these. Including inclusive taxes is how the system was hard-coded in older versions of Bepoz, but it's now optional. By the way, for this course, I am using version 4712, but in older versions of the software was hard-coded, but it is now optional for us to include inclusive taxes. Also, for the include handling fee flag, this only applies to some countries and regions in order to add tax onto handling fees and ensure that all sales reports are going to balance, since the handling fee will be included in the net total. If that's being implemented, then a product needs to be set here for the handling fee product for handling fees to accrue to and report as. So in this instance, depending on what version you're on, in the latest versions of Bepoz, a default product is going to be created along with the database and assigned here, and it's called handling fee product. Cool. Now, most importantly, these flags should only be configured by a qualified Bepoz technician who fully understands the impact of these settings, and must be completed during system setup, which is why we're going over this now. Reason being that the nature of financial data is that financial data cannot be altered retrospectively. So making changes to these flags after a system has gone live and transactions have been recorded, completed, could then cause a reporting imbalance if these were to be changed after the fact. In fact, if I try to change some of these flags, we are going to be hit with a friendly warning prompt being shown, just notifying us of that these could affect the balancing of existing sales reports. Cool, that will be a wrap on global settings for now for this System Setup 101 lesson, but we will come back again. We'll come back to related configuration settings and so forth in their respective lessons. For now, we will check out some important venue level settings. Now, the difference between the global level settings that we were just looking at and these venue level settings is the global settings apply to the organization as a whole, whereas these settings apply only to the specific venue, meaning that if the organization is multi-venue, each venue can have different settings configured at the venue level, although many are recommended to remain the same from venue to venue. Again, we won't be getting into multi-venues in detail in this course, but wanted to highlight the difference between the global level and venue level settings. And the same goes for the store and workstation settings that we'll come to next. Different stores within the same venue can have some of their own configuration set, and each workstation can be configured differently as well, depending on how it's going to be used. As far as the venue settings themselves go, we'll just start from the top in this header section, which, by the way, will always stay at the top of the venue maintenance window, regardless of which tab is selected. So as I select through these, you can see that the header section stays in place. There isn't actually a whole lot to go over here. The venue name we've already discussed. The venue group really only applies to multi-venues. The server workstation dropdown, though, is where we can set the workstation that this device, the machine that back office is running on, is connected to. So I'll just leave that as the first workstation. It will be set to till 1 by default, but we can change that if we need to. As with the global settings, venue settings are indeed split out into the tabs as you saw, just to make configurations organized and easier to locate and so forth. Also, as with the global settings, we certainly won't be going through all of the venue settings in this lesson. We'll just highlight some key things for now that are necessary for getting the database configured at the start. And some other things within these venue settings will be covered in their respective lessons, or most things within venue maintenance that fit into the coursework will be covered. Cool, so on the main tab here is where we will spend most of our time in this lesson. Actually, we'll skip some of the self-explanatory things at the top here, but I do want to highlight the importance of setting the correct country or region. First of all, actually, when a country is selected, if it has multiple states or regions, the region dropdown will be populated automatically. So if I select a different country, for example, USA, we'll have the different states and territories of the United States available there, and if we change it to Australia, we'll have the different states and territories of Australia available for us. So just make sure that you've got your correct country and region selected there. There are certain rules for individual regions, so this does need to be set up correctly. Cool. Over to the service charge setup section that pops out for us there, and we will get to this another time when we come to a lesson on service charges and discounts, and we will actually skip down to some of these miscellaneous settings and just fire through a bunch of significant ones here, starting with the max sale quantity. That is simply the maximum quantity that can be selected at the till for adding a product to a transaction. So if we do want to limit that, we can set that to maybe 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever we decide that the maximum sale quantity could be. If it is set to $9.99 here by default, we can just leave that. There is also a product level flag that can override this for individual products if needed, but this will be setting it at the venue level. While we're on the topic of quantities, the one below that is used in conjunction with a product flag called no oversell, which is used to prevent a product from being sold when its quantity on hand gets below a certain level. So this is where we can set the quantity that will trigger a warning prompt in SmartPOS notifying operators that a product's quantity is getting low. Cool. Another couple that should be set now for financial reporting purposes are the cash rounding and price rounding. The cash rounding refers to rounding for a transaction total. For example, if it's set to 0.05, so 5 cents here, which it is by default, and the transaction total comes to $19.97, it will be rounded up to $20. Price rounding, on the other hand, is referring to rounding prices for individual products, and this affects, when we come to percentage discounts and surcharges, this affects those. So this is also set to 0.055 cents by default, but can be changed. So an example would be if, let's say, a product's price within a transaction is brought to $4.22, it will be rounded down in that case to $4.20. Cool. We will skip down a few more. These point settings will be covered in their own lesson, but we will come down to product sales store now and chat about this. So this refers to the way that product sales reports will actually report. Some of this may make a bit more sense after going through some other lessons, but for now, just know that both the pricing and stock can be directed from one store to another if there are multiple stores in a venue or in the organization. So we do want, we need to decide, do we want product sales to always report to the till store of where the products are being sold, or always print to the pricing store, which is oftentimes the same store, but because pricing can be redirected, it isn't always the same, or always report to the stocking store, which is also oftentimes the same as the till store, but stock can be redirected as well. The rest of the miscellaneous settings here we'll save for their respective lessons. We will check out this tendering options section here though, which allows us to set maximum tendering limits or payment limits that an operator can process without needing a manager authorization for each tender type. Also in this section, we can choose to hide certain tender types from even being displayed on the standard payment screen on tills in the venue. Again, these are all venue level settings. If maybe it's a cashless venue or something like that, for example. Alright, that brings us to the dates and times and the closely related shift detail section, which are very important and a very good idea to get set up when the system is initially being configured. The long and short of it is that these work to control how the venue structures not only their days, but even their weeks, months, and years within Bepoz for reporting purposes. As far as the max shifts per day, first, what is a shift? I'm sure we all know what a shift is operationally, but for our purposes, a shift, we can think of a shift as a balancing period for reports. To put it another way, these could also be described as the time periods that an operator or operators spend at the till, and for which there then needs to be a cash balance. If you're familiar with the concept of a cash register's X and Z slips, those are eliminated with our shift configurations. So if an operator has the right till privileges enabled, they can run a report for the current shift details as many times as needed in SmartPOS. Doing so can also prompt for an optional shift change, provided that the function map is set up for it. The till function maps we'll cover in a couple of lessons, but these are things that can be done from the till. We can run these financial reports, such as the current shift details, and can change from one shift to another. If at that point that the shift is being changed, other shifts are available for the current day, it will allow for moving to a new shift, whichever the next available shift is. But if more shifts are not available, then that's that, and the system won't allow for moving from the shift that it's currently on, and there won't be a change until the start time of day. More on that in a minute. It is important to know how many shifts are needed, and to set the max shifts per day accordingly, just based on how the venue is going to operate. So moving over to the shift details section for now, since they're related to and based on the max shifts per day, this section here is used to just define the shift's names and the earliest start time for each shift. So we might just name our first shift here, since we do have this set to 4. Maybe we'll change it to 3 shifts per day, and we'll just have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then we'll change our earliest start times maybe to 12 p.m. and we'll change our dinner earliest start time to 5 p.m. Cool. So first and foremost, the earliest start time for shift number 1 is just going to be set automatically based on the start time of day that's set over here. We will be prevented from actually changing it for shift 1, but we can change the start time of day here, which will then update that for us. The additional shift's earliest start times can be configured just as required for the venue's operational or business needs. And by the way, we don't have to enter shift names here. If they are not entered, they will just assume the names of shift 1, shift 2, etc. for reporting purposes. But if we do name them, then the shift names will show in reports. Cool, so I've mentioned this start time of day a couple times. What is that all about? It is essentially the earliest time that the venue would begin a new day for financial and other reporting purposes. So the final shift of the day would end, and the first shift, in this case breakfast, of the new day can begin, or does begin. It doesn't have to be at midnight, obviously, which is why we even have the option, rather than just forcing it to 12 a.m. as the start time of day, and as you can see, it actually defaults to 3 a.m. So the second that the clock server workstation, the clock of the server workstation's system hits 3 a.m., the system moves all tills to the new day and to shift 1 of that new day. There are also housekeeping tasks that the system automatically performs at the start time of day, so it should be set ideally to the quietest time possible, or a time when there is either no activity happening in the venue or minimal activity happening in the venue. Important to note, the system will still perform well even if the site is a 24-hour operation. The main point that should be noted is that all sales end for the previous day at the start time of day, and the new day commences with sales and cash reporting to it at the start time of day. So it is as much an end time of day or a cutoff mark as it is just simply a start time of day, if we want to think about it like that. Okay, we'll move down to our date format here, where we can choose from day, month, year, month, day, year, or year, month, day. Just to reflect how the date will be displayed for the menu. More often than not, it's just going to match with the standard date format in the venue's country or territory or region. Which brings us down to the calendar and the settings below the calendar dropdown, which will need a bit of explanation, and it's important to set these up right at the start. We could go into depth and explain examples of each one, but it would probably double the length of this lesson, which is pretty long to begin with. But to simplify it, these options allow for configuring how a full year is going to be broken up into reporting periods along the lines of months. Now, I choose my words carefully there. I say along the lines of months because these reporting periods do not always fit into the standard 12 months as we know them in the Gregorian calendar. So these periods are defined for the venue by determining the start and end of each period, which is then used for reporting purposes. As with the other settings that we're going over today, the choice of the calendar option being used is of course going to be based on the venue's operational requirements. But anyway, these are the options that we have available. We've got standard, which means that the reporting months are just the same as a calendar year, as the Gregorian calendar. Then we have previous week and next week. So for both of these options, if I select one, we will still have the 12 reporting months for the year, and most months will be 28 days, so they're shortened to 4 weeks, most months. But there will be some months in this 12-month reporting period that will be 35 days, so they're lengthened or extended to 5 weeks. That depends on how the days fall, and will depend on the start day of the week that is set here. So no matter what, weeks and reporting months will all begin on whichever day of the week is set as the start day of week. For example, if we set Monday as the start day of week, then all months' reporting periods will always begin on a Monday. Now, in instances where the calendar month begins on a day that is not also a start day of week, we have to decide where to allocate those extra days. So we'll stick to our scenario with the start day of week being set to Monday. If an actual calendar month then begins on, say, a Wednesday, do we want to go back and begin our reporting month on the previous Monday? That's previous week option here. Or skip ahead and begin our reporting month on the next Monday. That's the next week option here. So in the case of the previous week option, the system will include the previous week in the new month, going back to the most recent start day of week prior to the first of the month. And for the next week option, if an actual calendar month starts on a day that isn't the start day of week, the new reporting month starts on the next start day of week. Hopefully I've explained that clearly. So now that we have an understanding of the previous week and next week calendar options, where we do have the 12 reporting periods, which is similar to a standard calendar, but where some monthly reporting periods again are going to be shortened to 28 days and others are going to be 35, should make it easier for us to understand these 13 period options. So with these, rather than have the mix of 28 and 35 day reporting periods in a given year, there are going to be 13 periods of 28 days, 4 weeks each. Now, if we do some quick math, 365, which is the standard days in a calendar year, is not evenly divisible by 28. 13 28-day periods only gives us 364 days. Also, I think we're all familiar with leap years, which obviously have an extra day. So on a rolling calendar from year to year with the 28-day periods, they will not be the same. There's also a chance that we could end up with a 53rd week in these 13 period options. That concept also applies to this business calendar option here as well. So, speaking of which, the business calendar option is a little bit different, but it gives some flexibility to the venue regarding how they'd like to structure their quarters and their reporting periods. To begin with, as you can see, this section has dynamically populated some different fields below, which removes the options to set the start day of week and the start month of year, and instead allows for selecting an all-time start date here, and then a weeks per period format for each of the 4 quarters. So we can choose from either 445, 454, or 544, and they don't need to be the same for each quarter if we don't want them to be, which is why we can set them for each of the 4 quarters here. But each quarter will be 13 weeks regardless of the format selected, and because each of the 4 quarters is split into 3 separate reporting periods, that obviously gives us 12 total reporting periods using this option. In this case, some periods will be 28 days, others will be 35. Again, the caveat being a 53-week year. So as I've been explaining all this, I've been avoiding using the word month to describe the reporting periods, especially using the business calendar method, because the reporting periods may not fit into the bounds of a typical calendar month. It will depend ultimately on the start date that's been selected, and then also on the weeks per period format that's been chosen. And because our start date can be any date, any day of the week, any month, any year, we are telling the system basically this date is our starting parameter for reporting. So imagine that from now on, we are going to disregard the calendar as we know it and say that today is day 1, period 1, quarter 1, year 1. That's essentially what the business calendar option provides from a reporting standpoint. Now, one very important thing to keep in mind here is that whichever day of the week the start date falls on will be the ongoing start day of week for reporting when using the business calendar here. Now, obviously, whichever start date a venue chooses is probably going to have some fiscal or operational significance to them. Anyway, for the purposes of this database, I'm just going to set this to standard. I will set the start day of week as Monday, and I'll leave the start month of year for January. Obviously, for any of these calendar options, they are all going to depend on organizational preferences, potentially when the organization's financial year starts. It may not be January, so forth, and things like that. But anyway, we will move on from this dates and times section because there is a bit more to cover before we can wrap this lesson up. And I know the calendar stuff can be a bit boring, and again, we could spend a lot more time on this. It is important. But anyway, for now, the last thing we will look at on this main tab is the tax setup over here, which is going to open a new window for us. By default, it is going to have the appropriate tax rates for whichever region has been selected. We can optionally change whatever the defaults are set in here. It's going to be up to 8 different tax rates if required. We need 1 for Australia here in New South Wales. Cool. If anything is changed there, you can see the venue record should be saved immediately and the entire system should be restarted. We will move on to the flags tab. There's a few things here that we should go over while we are chatting about System Setup 101, and others we will come back to in upcoming lessons. First up is in the system flag section here. It is called Request Authorization Daily, which, if it's turned on, it will require the system to request a new auth code twice every day. Next one down, for this average stock not FIFO flag, we will cover this in more detail when we get to stock control lessons, but we do recommend FIFO, which is short for first in, first out, as a stock control method, which is the default. However, we can enable this flag, and we'll get a warning prompt there. We can enable this flag if we would like to change the system to utilize the average stock method in the venue if we would like to. It is not recommended to change this after any sales or stock activities have occurred in the system, and once it's been set to average stock, it cannot be reverted back. That's what all this is telling us here. We'll abort those changes. Cool. Next one down, allow till offline immediately. This means that if it's turned on, tills in the venue will go into offline mode straight away in the event of something like a server failure or a till loses connection to the server. Otherwise, the till would need to be restarted to go offline, so we can turn that on if we would like to. And we will skip over everything else in this tab for now, except for some of these security flags. First up being the all PCI security settings flag, which will set venue requirements to what's called PCI PA DSS compliant. For example, it will enforce some stricter password requirements and also auto closing of some back office windows if that flag is turned on. In some countries, enabling this is required if a linked FPOS or card authorizations are in use. Speaking of passwords, we then have a few related flags here. Pretty self-explanatory, but we can force all operators to need a password to be able to log in. We can enforce that passwords need to be a minimum of 7 digits and include a mix of alpha and numeric characters there for if we set complex passwords on. And we can also enforce password changes every 90 days if we'd like to. We can also turn on this limit 5 failed logons flag, which means that after 6 consecutive incorrect passwords have been entered for an operator login attempt, that operator will be logged out of the system for 30 minutes. And finally, in this section, we can turn these flags on to require operators to enter passwords at the till when logging on manually using their operator number, or if they are utilizing some sort of scanned logon peripheral, such as a swipe card, for example. Cool. The rest of our venue settings we will not be getting into detail today, but it is good at least for now to point them out for you so you know where they are. So if we jump over to the names tab, most things here will be covered during other lessons. For example, discounts and surcharges and the price name sections we'll be going over in a lesson on our price numbers and manual discounts. We'll actually cover them briefly in our product related lesson, but these are where we can define the system's basically the system's discount buckets for reporting purposes and set up different price levels here that might be used for things like account pricing or takeaway pricing and so forth. We've got size help over here, which we will touch on when we get into product maintenance. Down here we've got some credit cards and currencies, some other name settings over here and printer types, all of which will be covered in their separate respective lessons. Onto the external links tab. This encompasses some advanced topics that will not be covered in this course, but these are used to configure things for just different third-party integrations and interfaces and things like that. The tables tab will be covered in its entirety in a lesson on table service. And the messaging and billing tab also contains some topics that will not be covered in this course, but we can use this tab to set up things like email configurations for emailing reports to operators, emailing suppliers, emailing account holders, and so on. And we can also use this tab to set up scheduled billing to be used with accounts and memberships. We will wrap up venue maintenance for now, and we will check out some store maintenance settings. So I will just, I think I've changed a few things here that I want to keep, so I'll click OK to save that. And we will quickly check out some store maintenance settings. First things first, you can see that there are not nearly as many settings at the store level as what we have at the global or the venue levels. And some of these settings we actually won't get to in this course, and some we will get to in their respective lessons. But the one store setting that we will chat about for now are these default margins here on the General tab. This section allows for setting the default margin that's going to apply to stock in the store. And the first decision that we need to make is whether the default margins are going to be set either by product types or by product sorts. So another use case for the sorts and types that we looked at and set up earlier. So we could select either use types for default margins or use sorts for default margins, and whichever one is selected is just going to auto-populate the margin fields, or the names of the margin fields, to represent the system's product types or product sorts as we have defined within global settings. The purpose of setting these is so that when a new product is created but the inventory for it has not yet been entered into the stock system or been brought into the system will use the margin that's been set here for the product's type or sort, whichever has been set for that product, so that sales of the product will show that assigned group margin and give us some valid profit reporting until the stock is entered and the system has the correct product cost to operate with. At that time, the system will automatically make a correction back in time for the margin that was reported and the actual margin it should have been, or it should have, based on the actual cost. But we can set the defaults here. We can either do so manually using the set all margins button here, or we can do it automatically using the set margins from sales button here. Selecting set all margins is going to open a small window for us where we can enter the default margin percentage to be applied. It's going to have 70 entered by default, but we can just change that to something else if we'd like to. Alternatively, once the system does have some sales in it, we could hit set margins from sales, and the system will analyze what the default margins are based on the previous month's sales, and we'll set those automatically. No sales found, of course, because we've got a brand new database here. Cool, that will do it for store settings for now. Again, we'll come back and touch on some other configurations here in other lessons, but I will just actually cancel out of those settings for now. And last up in the venue stores and tills list, other than devices that we looked at already, are the tills. So workstation maintenance, workstations are also known as tills, and we often use these words interchangeably. You can see this is actually labeled as till/workstation. So these settings will apply to the instance of SmartPOS that is running on hardware and set up as this till. So we'll pretty much be starting and ending with the header section here, because just about everything else within workstation maintenance is going to be covered another time. But yeah, we've got the workstation name. It's simply going to be used to define this till number throughout back office, including reports. That name is also going to be displayed on the SmartPOS workstation screen itself once an operator logs in, so that that particular workstation can be identified. Next to that, we've got the IP address. So that should be entered as that of the venue's smart controller as accessed from head office or another venue if it is the server. Otherwise, it is the local IP address of that SmartPOS workstation. Cool. Over on the far right here, we've got this inactive flag, and this can be used to temporarily make a workstation inactive, meaning that it cannot be used, although it will still show in reports, but it won't be able to be used, and we can see it'll take on this lovely salmon color here. Now, the is workstation flag, this does need to be on for any computer or till that needs to run back office, and if it is off, back office will not be able to run on that device, so that's why we've got it on here. And till mode, this is a very important one too. There are 6 different till modes to choose from depending on how the till will be used, and whichever one is selected will affect the behavior and the configuration options that will be available for it. So if I actually tab down through these, we can see that a lot of the settings here are going to change dynamically depending on what's been chosen and what the till is going to be used for. Each of these till modes does have a separate purpose, but in this course, throughout this course, we will be sticking just to this till mode. Cool. Next to that, we've got our main store and inward store. Main store is referring back to the concept that I mentioned earlier about having the ability to redirect prices and stock between stores. So we'll get more into that another time, but by default, this is going to be set to the store that the till is in, but it can be set to a different store. Whichever store it is set to will be the store that's going to be used for reporting, deducting stock, and getting prices for this workstation. Then for the inward store, this is the store that stock will be received into if this workstation is used to receive stock. For a bit more context on that, so we can use SmartPOS for stock functions, including receiving stock directly from the till itself. So this workstation may be in a store, but shouldn't necessarily receive stock through it to that store, if that makes sense. And stock that's received through this workstation in that store should actually be received into a different store instead. So we could change that here if we had, in this case, we do only have one store configured at the moment. We will have a lesson on multiple stores coming up, but and at that point we'll come back to these. But yeah, also good to know, I should mention that the inward store can be changed on each individual receipt, so when we get into stock control we will touch on that again. Cool. As for this till setup tab though, we will be returning to detail these settings as needed in other lessons, but as you can see, there's a variety of configuration options here, some self-explanatory, some not, that are used to control how the workstation will behave, how it's going to look aesthetically, so on and so forth. On the printing setup tab, this will be covered in a lesson on receipt and remote printing, and a majority of the settings here on the flags/other tab, while again a lot of these are self-explanatory and I'm confident you could work out a lot of them on your own. Others will need some explanation as we get to related topics in other lessons. We will come back to and refer to them. Cool, I'll just click OK to save that. Lastly, before we wrap up this lengthy session on System Setup 101, we need to at least quickly discuss the system setup, just this menu overall. This is where we can find all sorts of things that a system administrator would find useful. So aside from what we've seen, so being able to admin and configure the global, venue, store, and till settings as we've just seen, we can also do things like plan out till function maps, manage custom audits, maintain what are called scheduled jobs, and supplier communications, configure our overall points profiles for the system, and we can define things like card prefixes, printer definitions, We sometimes have one in here called data rules. I must have my operator settings configured to not allow access to data rules at the moment. And we also have external payments that can be maintained from here as well. So most of these individual system setup components will be covered either in part or in detail throughout other lessons in this course, but at least for the time being, you'll know that these things exist, that these components exist, and where they can be found if you do decide to have a look before we get a chance to cover them in this course. But that is going to be a wrap on this lesson. We'll see you for the next one when we cover operator setup in depth. Thank you very much for your time and attention.